guys for my artwork. I'm not an artist, but hopefully you can get the idea across. I thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you. Uh, I'm not going to get too much into my personal story and how I became to be a believer. Uh, when I was asked to come, my first question was, well, who is the audience I'm going to be speaking to? And I understand that everybody here has basic understanding of cannabis. I don't think there's anybody going to be here that still needs to be convinced of the potential utility. So I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about some of the basic science. A lot of people hear about terms and they don't quite understand what it means. My personal philosophy as a physician is something I take very close to heart when I'm dealing with my patients. I think it's much better to have some idea of why and how, not just this is what you should do. And if you're going out and trying to talk to people that need some convincing, the more you understand about the why and the how, I think the more rational of a discussion you can make. So I'm going to talk tonight basically about cannabis receptors, and I'm sure everybody has heard about receptors, and maybe talk a little bit about what they really are, because not only does it have to do with cannabis, but it also has to do with drugs, pharmaceuticals. It has to do with how your body works. You know, the human body has, I heard someplace, some 37 trillion cells within it. And in order to make a somewhat rational being, those cells have to communicate with each other to get whatever the organism needs to be done. So we have to talk a little bit about cell biology and about receptors. And so I think that's going to be one of the real crucial building blocks where you start. So we'll talk about cell membranes. Every cell in the body is like a little balloon. It has everything held within it. All of the chemicals processes that go on between cells have to get from outside the cell to inside the cell. So you have to understand what a cell membrane is first. And in order to talk about a cell membrane, you have to understand a little bit about phospholipids primarily, but some kind of a lipid ingredient. Now, as I was finishing up my dinner, I heard somebody over here say something about oil and water don't mix. Oil and water don't mix. So what the cell membrane is basically made of lipids. Now, a very simplistic diagram of what a lipid is, it usually is going to have a little head, if you will, that is more likely to be soluble in water. And that's where all the other chemical actions take place. But it has these little tails, if you will, that are more fatty in nature. Well, when you put these together, the tendency is going to be for the tails to hang out together. You have a lipid tail here, a lipid tail here. They're going to tend to be drawn to each other, whereas the parts that tend to associate with water are going to be on the outside. So you have a layer of the parts of it that associate with water. You have sort of two layers of the fatty part that hang out together, and then the watery attractive part on the other side. So this is going to be part of the cell wall. This makes a big circle like a balloon. And just for general definition, the part below the cell wall here is going to be inside the cell, and the part up here is going to be outside the cell. Now, if you have stuff that is involved in water that has to get from one side of this membrane to the other, it doesn't like to go across where the fat is. So you have proteins that are built into this that bridge one side to the other. Now, I'm going to describe these as receptors, and these receptors are primarily responsible for getting information from outside the cell to inside the cell. And when I talk about the effect that you're going to get when a receptor is engaged, that doesn't necessarily mean that it increases an effect or decreases or changes. It could be any of those things. A lot depends on what activates the receptor as far as what kind of effect you get. So you start off with the receptor, and this is made out of proteins, and it goes from one side of the cell membrane to the other, and it's just sitting there waiting for something to happen. Now, something's going to come along, and the medical term for that is a ligand, but it's something where you notice on this side of the cell, I drew a little W-shaped thing. A lot of people have described ligand receptor interactions as a lock and a key. That's probably a little bit simplistic in nature, and I'll explain why in a second. But I'm going to give as an example of this, not cannabis, but something that I'm sure everybody has at least some understanding of, and that is glucose and insulin. Typically, you have to have insulin to get glucose from outside the cell to inside the cell. So in this case, insulin is the ligand. Insulin comes, it attaches to the receptor. Now, the way this works is that when the ligand interacts with the receptor, it's held together by very specific chemical things that physically change the shape of that receptor, and that allows it to happen. So in this example, insulin comes along, binds the receptor, it opens up a pathway that allows the glucose to go through. And part of the maintenance part, the body's going to get rid of that after it does its job. And depending on whether there's a tight affinity or a loose affinity, that can be there for a long time, a short time. It varies a lot. And then whatever effect happens here is going to be how that message from outside the cell gets to inside the cell. So I'll give you a few more examples of ligand receptor interaction in a little bit. But the bottom line of it is you have something here that causes a change in the membrane so that something else happens inside the cell. And it's all part of the communication from cell to cell. And so what we're talking about right now are cannabinoid receptors. Now, cannabinoid receptors, as far as we know right now, there are two of them that are definitely identified. Not only do we know about them, we can make them. And those are generally referred to as CB1 and CB2. I have a big question mark down here because it is almost certain, and we really believe, that there are more than just those two receptors. But we know about CB1, CB2. This is the beginning of the understanding process of how does cannabis work within the body. So I'll spend a little time talking about CB1 and CB2, and then just remember, this ain't all of them. There's going to be more out there, I'm absolutely certain. Now, within the body, we have cannabinoids that our body makes as part of our own natural process of being. These are called endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids, cannabinoids that our body makes for our functioning. Now, I talked about one. This is the first one that was identified. It's called anandamide. So it does have a name. It's known. We can make that as well. But the body makes this particular chemical. There are others out there. We know one other. It has a much harder name to do, so I didn't put this down on there. But there are multiple cannabinoids that our own body makes. In this case, anandamide is mostly effective against the CB1 receptors, more so than the CB2. Now, not only do you find cannabinoids within our body, but cannabinoids are there within the plant that people talk about as being the marijuana plant. So the phytocannabinoids are the cannabinoid similar to this, but that will react with the CB1 and CB2 and whatever other CBs there are out there to do many of the same things. We all know about THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and this one, THC, the effect is about the same for the CB1 versus the CB2 receptors. And CBD, which actually doesn't bind with the cannabinoid receptors, is felt like the big effect of the CBD is it inhibits the breakdown of this endocannabinoid. So the end result is you have a little bit more of the anandamide. So there's a lot of interaction between these and receptors and the effect that it has overall. So let's talk just a little bit more about the phytocannabinoids. We got THC, we got CBD, everybody knows about there, but there are also lots of other cannabinoids that are out there, probably over 100 of them in the plant. Now, we don't know what a lot of these do. It may well be that some of these other cannabinoids are part of progression from this chemical to this chemical to this chemical and don't do anything. Or it might react in some ways that the others don't. So part of what I think is important to understand about a cannabis product out of the plant is that we still don't know which of those cannabinoids do what. And we don't know how they react with whatever receptors are out there. It's an incredibly complex system that we still are just barely beginning to scratch the surface on understanding. So let's talk about what we do know. Let's talk about CB1 for a second. I put up here 1988 because that's when they first identified this as a receptor. I graduated medical school in Charleston in 1978. We weren't told anything about the cannabinoid system, endocannabinoid system, because they didn't know anything about it at that time. Only in 1988 was there the discovery of this particular receptor. So for the purpose of right now, I have two questions. Where are they and what do they do? So if you look at the CB1 receptor, first question, where do you find them? The vast majority of CB1 receptors are someplace in the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves. You can find some of the CB1 receptors in other tissues, but that's where most of them are. And what do these receptors do? They modify the effects of other neurotransmitters. So let's talk about the nervous system just for a moment. What a neurotransmitter is, you have a nerve cell here that needs to talk to another nerve cell here. And how these communicate with each other, how many connections, it's very similar to what you see in a modern computer where you have lots of different pathways of signals to go to. But the way one nerve cell talks to another nerve cell is at the end of, and this is the one that signals going that way, you have all these little vesicles that contain within them neurotransmitter chemicals, and there are a number of those that are out there. If the signal comes down this one, this nerve cell, then some of these vesicles, little blebs inside the cell that have the neurotransmitter, migrate to the surface, break open, and then the chemicals actually cross the physical distance from one nerve cell to another. And then these chemicals attach to, guess what? Receptors in that second cell. So they transmit the signal by way of neurotransmitters to the receptors to then do something to the signal on the other side of what's called the synaptic cleft. So that's the way a nerve cell talks to an adjacent nerve cell. And this incredible complex network is just how the nervous system works. And when you're talking about when it gets into the brain, nobody understands how that happens. It's just a remarkable thing. So this central nervous system part, the effects may have to do with movement, learning, analgesia. Pain is moderated through the nervous system. Anxiety, appetite, cravings, a wide variety of things with how we function as far as what we're thinking, what we're feeling, how our body moves. So this is basically the CB1 receptor. After a lot more research, then they came up to the CB2 receptor. This was discovered in 1993. So we're still talking relatively recent discoveries. Where do you find the CB2 receptors? You find them a little bit in the central nervous system, but not a lot. Most of them are out in the periphery of the body. You see them related mostly to the body's immune system, white blood cells. Did anybody ever know that tonsils actually part of your body's immune system? They are. But you find them in the tonsils. You find them in the spleen, the thymus. I bet you don't even know what a thymus is, but it's important. Maybe not autoimmune in the gut and in the urinary tract, but there are effects in those tissues as well. Now, somebody was talking earlier about inflammation. Inflammation comes from the body's immune system. A lot of people don't really understand why is there inflammation in the first place. Body tries to fight off a foreign invading bacteria. It draws chemicals that attack this foreign invader. That is inflammation. Inflammation is a healthy thing. It helps keep us safe. But there comes a point when the inflammation no longer serves a purpose. There are a variety of reasons. It's not fighting off an invading virus or bacteria. It's attacking our own bodies. It causes damage. It causes pain. That's what inflammation is all about. So the CB2 receptors seem to be most related to the reduction of inflammation. So there's, from what I'm understanding, those effects are probably the cornerstone of a lot of what cannabis does. But inflammation is present in a lot of pathological disease processes. So a lot of that is interesting from the standpoint, at least interesting to me, about what is the underlying process, but then it gets to how can cannabis be used in the body to help. Getting back to the receptor issue, drugs that are manufactured, the pharmaceutical products that we use, are chosen and work to affect those receptors in ways that we want them to. Part of the problem with cannabis, and part of the reason that it's going to be so difficult to get it accepted in the same class as we do with other pharmaceuticals, is that I believe that there is sometimes a belief that a pharmaceutical works because there's one thing that affects one product. and that is not the case with cannabis. You have all the different cannabinoids, and for one particular indication, a blend, a balance of different cannabinoids is what works for this particular problem. A total different blend or balance of cannabinoids is going to work for something else. So to say it's all THC, it's all CBD, isn't going to work. So the traditional studies that are being done for pharmaceutical products are based on the assumption that it's a one product, one effect. And I believe that cannabis, with the multitudes of cannabinoids out there, is not going to fit that mold. So it's going to be really hard to do the kind of studies that pharmaceutical companies and many physicians believe is necessary to say it's okay to use. But there was a study that was released, probably about a year ago now. This is from the National Academy of Science. If you ever hear anybody say, well, we need to understand it better, we need to know more about cannabis before we can do anything with it. Let me introduce you, if you don't know already, about the National Academy of Science. Many, many years ago, Congress developed the National Academy of Sciences, whose function is to take the brightest, smartest, most educated people in the world and come up with an organization that is designed to give Congress as much information as possible when they need to understand to make laws. Right now, the Academy of Science, I don't know the exact number, it has something like 20-something Nobel Prize winners in it. It has thousands of individuals who are some of the brightest scientists in the world. This group did a study where they reviewed 10,000 scientific articles to come up with what is known about cannabis and come up with some ideas. And what they found in this study, and I'm going to talk about their conclusions based on how much evidence the scientific research is showing. Within the category of conclusive or substantial evidence, a lot of the things that they had are right here. There is conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis is useful for chronic pain. Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a side trip here talking about just a little bit of my history. I have chronic pain. When I was in medical school, I developed rheumatoid arthritis, an inflammatory problem. And for many years, the only way I could keep my pain under reasonable control was by taking Celebrex every single day. And Celebrex is safer than your naproxen, your ibuprofens, but it still has a very high incidence of gastric upset, bleeding ulcers. But I was willing to take that because I wanted to have some relief of my pain. Well, a little bit later on, my heart doctor wanted me to get on aspirin for my heart. Well, my primary care doctor, who is a gastroenterologist, told me to do a lot of his research. If you take Celebrex, which is generally pretty safe for the gut, and if you add any aspirin to it, you lose every bit of protective effect that you get, and you're back to taking your ibuprofen every day. It's only a matter of time. You will bleed from your gut. So I didn't want that to happen. So around that time, I discovered CBD oil, and I started taking it when I had pain instead. And I have taken no Celebrex probably for about the last year and a half because it is that effective for me, because the cannabis that's in the CBD oil is effective against inflammatory problems. And as I'm getting a little bit more osteoarthritis, it's also helpful for chronic pain, because a lot of what happens in chronic pain is damage to the nerves that transmit those pain signals, and it becomes an inflammatory problem within the nerve, what we call neuropathic pain. So I have found from my personal experience, and many people that I've talked to have found that it is excellent for chronic pain as well. And then if you get beyond that, well, what else is there? You got your anti-inflammatory drugs, which GI bleeds, and we all hear about the opioid epidemic and how many people are dying every day from opioids that got started because they needed some relief for their pain. So the practice of medicine is always a balance of benefit versus risk. And I have become a believer at this point that the benefits, even if you only look at pain and nothing else, is well worth any minimal risk of some people out there wanting to abuse cannabis because they just want to get high. Now, I have a whole nother talk about why I don't think that's a particularly valid argument, but to me, to say you should be depriving people of their pain relief because some people out there might want to abuse cannabis, that just doesn't make sense to me. But in addition to chronic pain, it is also found to be very helpful for nausea control, effect on the gut, and particularly in chemotherapy. MS with spasticity, painful muscle cramps, very helpful for that. Now, there are some negative things within this report, such as you could have worsening problems with breathing if you smoke the cannabis. I think that's not surprising, smoking anything, but this is just for the smoking part. There's an increased risk of motor vehicle accidents. Some people out there, if they try to drive when they get high, typically are going to tend to be slow drivers, not, driving with your foot to the metal like you would with alcohol. But, there is some impairment with judgment and reflexes. So I would see, MVAs definitely increasing. Lower birth rate of offspring. So, probably not a real good idea to use cannabis if you're pregnant. Development of schizophrenia with most frequent users. I have a friend that is a psychiatrist. We've gotten into a discussion, and he's scared to death about increasing the risk of schizophrenia. That's something we need to know about. But when I'm prescribing a drug, I need to evaluate my patient, not just their medical condition. So there may be some people out there that I don't want to give a particular medicine for because it might create problems. So this role of schizophrenia, according to the NAS study, it has to do with frequent users. But, I think from the medical side, we can be aware of that and try to help that. And problem cannabis use, if initiated in earlier childhood years. Now, the human brain doesn't fully mature until around the age of 25. So you can see that if you have a teenager that's using pot heavily recreationally, they might have more of a tendency to rewire their brain so they become more chronic problem cannabis users. Doesn't mean that kids can't use it, but you got to weigh the benefit of whatever it is you're treating versus the danger that there could be some problems with them. You have a child with bad seizure disorder, it's worth that risk. Yes.
Before you move off this page,
okay.
I have just a couple of questions, and I would, because otherwise I'll forget them. You're talking about increased risk of MVAs and the smoking. Is that because of smoking cannabis versus doing cannabis oil?
They were just looking at studies about the use of cannabis in general.
Okay,
And now for this particular one, I don't know the answer.
okay, because I will tell you, I had friends that had cancer in the early 70s, and they would smoke cannabis.
Mhm.
And I thought they were crazy because I didn't have any recollection of what's going on, but now I understand. I will tell you, I did get cannabis from them to give to my mother because she had schizophrenia, and it would calm her down. So I didn't see that it developed schizophrenia. I felt it had a more positive effect.
Yeah, and that's actually going to be in my next
Oh, okay. I just,
for that one.
I'm sorry.
And the thing about cannabis users getting high, I'll look at that much in the way I do alcohol. We know that small amounts of alcohol are very helpful, very healthy.
Right.
It's only when you do too much of it. So for the people who want to get high, they're wanting to maximize the THC and minimize the CBD, because CBD actually decreases the amount of activity that the THC is going to express. So people who just want to get stoned, they're the ones that are really pushing the level of THC. People who want to use cannabis for health reasons, vast majority of them, they don't want to get high. They just want to do better.
Yeah.
So the fear that you're going to have a lot of people stoned out by treating their health problems just doesn't cut it to me.
Okay.
Now, not only do you have conclusive or substantial, there are also a number of cases where there is moderate evidence. Now, there are some that have little pro con. I didn't even touch those, but I take even those with moderate evidence is saying there's something here. Maybe we don't understand it well enough. We need to understand it more. But for moderate evidence, improved sleep, a lot better than your Ambien. Increased risk of overdose injuries among pediatric users. Again, I'd be very cautious with kids if I were going to be giving at all. I would be a little bit more reluctant and restrictive in what I would recommend for them. Impairment of learning, memory, and attention if you're acutely using. You know, if you got a big project due and you really need to concentrate and get some studying done and learning, that's probably not the best time to get stoned. Better cognitive performance with psychotic disorders. So some of these people who have mental health issues, I think some of those may actually get better. You know, and I don't think I have it on this list, but it's been talked about people with Alzheimer's. You know, it's not going to cure their Alzheimer's, but it may be very helpful in calming the agitated person who has Alzheimer's. So to say it affects the brain doesn't necessarily carry with it a bad connection there. Increased symptoms of mania or hypomania with bipolar disorder. Don't know what that means. Small increased risk for development of depressive disorders. Now, here's one thing that I also like for people to understand. When you're seeing these types of statements, you have to be very careful about saying cause and effect versus association. Putting that into some common lingo, if you say A causes B, that's very different than saying A and B increase at the same time. So if you have an association statistically, A and B happen at the same time, does A cause B? Does B cause A? Or is there something else that causes A and B both? So just because there's a statistical correlation does not necessarily mean that there's causation. So you have to be really, really careful about how you interpret things like that. So when you say increased risk for development of depressive disorders, Well, does that mean that somebody who smokes pot is more likely to get depressed? Or does that mean that somebody who's depressed is more likely to smoke pot because they're depressed? So it's hard to know some of those things. Increased incidence of suicide completion. I don't know what that means. That just means that if you attempt suicide while stoned, you may be more likely to be successful with it. But I don't know how to interpret what that means as far as good, bad, or indifferent. Other things with moderate evidence. Increased incidence of social anxiety disorder. Again, are people with social anxiety disorder more likely to smoke pot because they feel better in social situations, or is it the other way around? I would be suspicious more people who have social anxiety just tend to do it because they tend to deal with their social anxiety problems a little bit better. There is no worsening of symptoms in people who already have schizophrenia, which kind of goes to what you said.
Yeah, it would calm my mother down, it'd make her
So,
relax.
This saying, it causes schizophrenia. We might find out somewhere down the road that if you take somebody that has no schizophrenia, put him on cannabis for some unrelated issue, might it cause them to become schizophrenia? We don't know that yet. There's some concern about that. But if you already have it, it's not going to make it worse. Major depressive disorder risk factor for development of problem cannabis use. Again, if you have depression, you might be more likely to get hooked on pot and really abuse it to your detriment. Problem cannabis use and increased severity of PTSD symptoms. I don't know, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. But again, there is some concern, and a lot of people will advocate that those with PTSD do much better with cannabis. And the one that law enforcement always talks about, development of substance dependence and or substance abuse disorder for alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. There's a lot of belief out there that people who start on cannabis will be led down the dark trail to other harder drugs. My feeling is you're always going to have some people out there with a dependency problem, an addiction personality, and they're going to get into that problem regardless of whether cannabis is there or not. Correct. I do not believe that cannabis by itself is going to lead people on to harder drugs. In fact, if you look at the statistics out there, it will also say that if you look at those people who are addicts, who use hard drugs, you have a higher correlation with alcohol and tobacco than you do with cannabis. So I think many leading experts do not believe that cannabis is a gateway drug. And if there is a gateway effect, a lot of people who are on opioids are more likely to be successful getting off of it if they can use cannabis instead. So it may be a gateway drug, but it may be a gateway for getting people off of cannabis, off of opioids. So this belief of cannabis leading to all sorts of increased crime, increased drug addiction, if you look at the real scientific evidence, it doesn't support that. But my personal belief, and this is generational, I grew up in the time where cannabis was in that reefer madness paranoia. And I think people who are convinced of the evils of cannabis have spent so many years thinking of it as an evil drug that it's really hard for them to back up and say, maybe I've been a little bit wrong for the last 30 years. Maybe it's not that bad. Particularly people in law enforcement who have it in concrete in their brain, this is an awful drug. So that's a lot of the resistance that I'm seeing, based not on evidence, but based on preconceived and faulty belief systems. So if anybody ever wanted to look further into a lot of the scientific evidence, I wrote down where you can find the information that I was talking about. This is about a 400-page document, but it does break down into a lot of areas, a lot of the things you should ever hear about. You can find it, you can download it for free. This is a government-sponsored program. So I have that on my iPad. If I ever want to look it up, I can just look it up. It doesn't cost a thing in the world, but there is how you can find out the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, the current state of evidence, and recommendations for research. So that's sort of a quick cannabis description from my viewpoint as a traditionally trained physician. My opinions are not universally held, but as I talk to doctors, I'm finding more and more of them beginning to say, well, maybe there is something there. So I think it's not a matter of if it becomes legalized. I think it's just going to be a matter of when. And I hope it isn't just because the old fogies like me die off and younger people have less stereotype start taking over. I'm hoping it happens before then. I'd like to see that in my lifetime.
We'll get you some stem cells. Keep you around
Well,
a little bit longer.
And I'm going to address that briefly. One of the problems I do see is that I do believe that there is a belief system that cannabis is going to fix everything out there. And I do not believe that to be the case.
It'll fix a lot of it.
So I think there are a lot of valuable resources. I don't think cannabis is going to fix everything. I don't think stem cells are going to fix everything. But I think that both are wonderful resources that we need to have available to use. Yeah. Any questions?
Are you, with a lot of this, what you're talking about, the effects, the reefer madness and so forth, and what law enforcement thinks, they're not dealing with the oil. They're not dealing with like sauteing marijuana leaves or putting them in a salad. They're seeing it dried and smoking and thinking this, because that's the only way you get high. And that's where they take it out of context. Because the people who have marijuana oil, it's for benefit. But I also see many of the 29 states that have legalized cannabis are now going after gun advocates. You have a gun, you're high, you can't, have marijuana.
I think
That's because it's a federal controlled substance.
Yes.
And I also think it's because, well, it's
It's
one of the
also-
arguments they put out there about they're afraid people are going to get high and drive, and there's no way to test for that because marijuana stays in your system for so long. It's not like alcohol where it metabolizes off. The problem with that argument is when they test for alcohol, they test for alcohol. When they test for marijuana, they test for cannabinoid metabolites instead of the cannabinoid. Once it's metabolized, you're no longer under the influence. But that they can test for those for however long after it stays in your system, which can be hours to weeks, depending on your
Months.
body. Months, probably, yeah. But if they actually tested for the cannabinoid itself, which I guess the one of most concern is THC, then it's either there or it's not. The metabolite's going to be there for a longer afterwards, and we don't test now for the THC. We test for the metabolites of it. And of course, I think that's on design too, because if we can't tell whether you're under the influence or not, we've got this whole argument about you can't have a gun because we're never going to know when you're under the influence or not. So I mean.
But again, that depends on how you are taking.
And how you are tested. Also, well, if you take the THC, even if you take it Delta 9 THC, if you take it in an edible, in your stomach it breaks down to a different, was it Delta 12? Is it or Delta 10? It's something like that, but it's another version of THC that's actually more psychoactive than Delta 9. So you could actually get higher from an edible than you could from smoking. The thing is, it's still got to metabolize in your system and be broken down to metabolites And we still need to be testing for the active cannabinoid instead of the metabolites if we want to be fair and honest about what we're doing.
Law enforcement in legal states, they use mouse swabs.
We've got
Mouse-
breathalyzers
They have some
now
mouse
too.
swabs they can work.
But are they testing for the metabolites
No.
or they're testing for
No,
the
they're testing
active,
for
the active cannabinoid, the active THC? And we can do that. I mean, we don't even do it when we test stuff they see. I mean, they test it for carboxylates instead of THC. And of course, I mean, you could take Douglas fir and test it for carboxylates and it's going to test positive in a field test for marijuana. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
we got to be, we need to bring this up that they need to be honest about their testing policies and how they're testing if they're going to be doing this stuff and making these arguments because they're not making legitimate arguments. There's a lot of falsehood, and they're using that to convince part of the public that they're scared. They're scared that we're all going to become stoned and nothing's going to get done, and it's just going to
I
be.
functioned so much better than
Yeah,
I
too.
was. Seriously, before I was in such a fog
Mhm.
and sick and, not sleeping.
Well,
How
your
do you
body-
function?
When you're in pain and you have other issues, your body produces all kinds of chemicals which can make you foggy. I mean, they can have bad psychological effects on you.
Then at opiates.
That's just the way it is.
But a lot of the objection from law enforcement as well as legislators is the slippery slope.
They're not
Thought.
educated.
If you get a little bit of legalized something, somebody's going to open the door, you're going to get more things, you're going to get bigger things. And
you
this progression into something much more nefarious is just what people are afraid is going to happen.
But we should also be making this argument that as long as we keep it illegal and people go out and attempt to self-medicate with the street strains of marijuana that are available, they're going to be getting the wrong stuff, and it's extremely high in THC, higher than it needs to be to treat the problems.
And that's
And
why there's
if
so
we
many
legalize
deaths.
it, and
Right.
they can get the right cannabinoid profile for their issue, it's not going to be that issue. And these kids aren't going to be going out and self-medicating with stuff that's got 23% THC in it, and who knows what else, and heavy metals or toxins or what else is in it.
To
Because
be-
they're strong.
To be fair, some people can take any amount of THC and not get high all day.
Well,
A large amount of patients are on cannabis for attention deficit and ADHD. And that's because the cannabis makes them focus.
right.
Through what I understand, retrograde inhibition, I don't know too much about it, I'm not a doctor. But I do know that a large amount of patients don't get stoned, they get straight and they're able to function.
But I know, I understand. What I'm
But
saying
let's
is,
say they
it's
get an
legal.
accident, they would be tested and they'd be rocket chart.
What I would be concerned about, them getting it off the street is the mold.
Yeah.
Pesticides.
The mold pesticides and
Pesticides.
heavy metals or
Yeah.
anything else, because
And
cannabis is a bioaccumulator.
That's
Whatever's
right.
in the soil is going to be in the plant.
that's one thing that I would like to see from potential legislation is the ability to get clean medicine.
And I'd like it not to tie it to gun control.
Yeah,
Because
Well-
if you're taking it in a form that you are not gonna get high, there's no reason.
yeah,
That has to change on a federal level, though. That has to do with federal,
No, it can be state nullification.
but
You can nullify at a state
We have
level.
to, we
We
have
have
Be
to-
in our bill.
we have to change who we have in government to be able to make that happen.
Yeah.
I think Pennsylvania's nullifying the,
I hope they are. I truly hope they are. They're realizing the outrage from the public that they're not putting up with it.
can we give Dr. Griffith a hand for his presentation?